I'll try not to be boring before a probably very good lunch here. My name is Gazulaa, but I'm not Harsh. I'm doing my PhD in Human Factors and Ergonomics from Texas Tech University. Today I'm going to talk about how we borrowed a concept from communications engineering called mutual information to identify the most or the major postural concerns or strategies in a tossing activity. So before I get into the not so technical details of my work, I'll try to give you a small example, a small intuition about what my work is all about. Well, this is not an evaluation class, okay? So probably everyone's life, more or less, I'm not talking about lives which have been cut short, but probably everyone's life would include different phases: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age. Different phases. Now this is the key word here, different phases in life. And it should also be noted that not all priorities are important in all phases of your life. So you have different priorities in different phases of your life. Now, when I'm talking about time, money, and energy, let's think about these as some constraints. So the types of constraints are different in different phases, and your constraints determine your priorities. Now, in cases of competing or maybe conflicting priorities, you always choose the priority where you're least uncertain about. When I say least uncertain, you're highly certain about it. So the keywords here are the phases, the priorities, and the constraints. And in addition to these constraints, there are different types of maybe social, psychological, and physiological constraints too. They determine what priorities you choose in different phases of your life. So something like system constraints, environmental constraints, and task constraints. That's how I classify them as. So now I get into the actual part of my work. This is a background which everyone have been presenting before me. I don't think I have to really go into this one. But one important thing here is the tossing part. So they say that tossing constitutes almost 1/3 of the manual material handling activity in the occupational setting. And probably it's also the major reason that it's responsible for low back pain, injuries, and all that stuff. So why tossing? Probably because it wasn't studied as much as lifting was studied in ergonomics literature. I'll point out a couple of differences and similarities between tossing. One reason maybe tossing wasn't studied as much as lifting was probably due to this one here. As long as you have the load in your hand, or as long as you have the load under your control, you don't see much difference between lifting and tossing here. The top part is the lifting here, and this is the tossing activity. Now once you lose control of the load in your hand, that's the primary difference between loading and tossing, I should say lifting and tossing. I just listed out some differences between lifting and tossing here. So again, the primary difference is the part where you don't have control over your load after you release it. And then maybe some differences in terms of the target, or in terms of the need. If you want to control your load in lifting, you don't really need higher velocities, whereas in tossing, you need to have some velocity at the time you release the load from your hand. So what are we really trying to understand here? We're trying to see if we can characterize the different postural concerns in each phase of the activity or during the duration of the activity. And also to understand how different constraints like height, weight, and distance tossed influence your tossing activity. Just a little background into type of experiment I performed. So we had mostly grad and undergrad students, as you see, 6 males and 4 females, and asked them to toss a small USPS box, which I'm sure most of you are aware of how it looks like, a small box, probably filled with bubble foam and paper wrap and all that, and asked with 3 different weights, asked them to toss at 2 different distances and 2 different heights. One is the floor, asked them to toss onto the floor, and also asked them to toss on a table, an adjustable table height, which is probably adjusted to their waist height. And 3 different tolerances. What tolerance means is the dimensions of the target, which are in proportionate with the dimensions of the box. So if you have a box of size 30 by 30, the target size would be 33 centimeters, if I'm talking about a box in centimeters. This again is just a picture of a subject with all the markers. I used 12 markers here, 6 on each critical joint on either side of the body, 3 more markers on the, 2 markers on the load and 1 marker at the target. Well, just to simplify life for myself, although we collected data in a 3-dimensional space and we have 3-dimensional data, I used only 2-dimensional data here, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm sure most of you would agree with me that most of literature deals with 5-segment models. Now, this is the most important part here. So, why did we really divide the activity into phases? Most probably because humans' physical and motor control hasn't evolved to a stage where they make decisions at each and every time point during performing the activity. So probably if there's any change they would like to make in terms of the performance, they would make it only in phases. So human doesn't really perform these calculations at each and every time point, rather in phases. So that's the motivation for why we divided this task into different phases. And these are the 4 critical events which I used: the lift off, the close to body, the peak, and release. So why 4 events and why not 6 or 7 events? Probably there's a trade-off between the amount of information you can gain by reducing the number of frames of information you have from your captured data. So my advisor in the past, he found out that these are the 4 critical events you can use to characterize any lifting or tossing activity. This slide shows how I used sample data to identify the different events. Again, as I said, it should be easy to identify when the activity started and when the activity ended. The 2 most other events in between are the closest to the body and the peak. So if I'm working in a XY direction, the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, so the lift off is the point where your wrist marker is at its lowest position in the vertical direction. And the closest to the body position is the point where the wrist is at its closest position. When it's closest position, in the negative direction of x-axis, the negative horizontal direction, at its lowest position. And the peak is obviously where the marker is at its highest point in the vertical axis. And the release is a little tricky here. I had to use a threshold. So I used the distance between the marker on the load and the wrist marker to identify the release. So I used a threshold maybe like 5 centimeters. So if the time point where the distance between the 2 markers is beyond 5 centimeters, I identify it as the release position. So 4 events, 3 different phases. Phase 1, phase 2, and phase, I'm sure they should be obvious from there. Now, so these are the different strategies. Again, this has been identified in the literature. There are 3 different strategies which most people use in a lifting activity: mobilization, stabilization, and muscular utilization ratio, or optimal strength utilization. So mobilization is about how smoothly you toss or lift the load. Stabilization is about how your body load system is stable enough. And then, so when I say the XCG and YCG are the center of gravity of the body load system. And the optimal strength utilization, or the muscular utilization ratio, is you're trying to maximize the joint activity. So you want to use as less joints, but with more activity as possible. So you don't want to distribute the activity between all the joints. So when I say muscular utilization ratio, is the ratio inside the brackets, the reactive movement against the maximal strength generated by a joint. So when we take a square, we are just trying to eliminate the, I'm not sure why we took the square of this one. Now, mutual information. This is something which we borrowed from communications engineering. It's mostly used in signal transmissions to characterize the entropy, the entropy of a signal. So what exactly is entropy? So before I talk about entropy, I think I should talk about information. So kind of they're related. Information is something which reduces uncertainty. So entropy is more or less a synonym for uncertainty here, at least in communications engineering. So probably, I'm sure most of you are aware of correlation used in statistics. The only case where correlation might fail is when the process or the random variables you're trying to find the correlation between are not linear. So if the random variables are non-linear, your correlation is not a good measure of the interaction or interrelationship between those 2 variables, or in the presence of outliers. So this is where mutual information comes into picture here. So when I'm performing a tossing activity and I characterize each of my objective functions as random variables, the interrelationships between them is the process is kind of non-linear. It's not linear unless you break it into some linear phases. So we're trying to use information, mutual information, as a measure of interrelationship between those two random variables. So higher the mutual information, lesser the uncertainty. Now you would see why I say lesser uncertainty. So I used the pair with the highest mutual information as the dominant strategy during the tossing activity. So now if I calculated the objective function values in 3 different phases, and obviously they lie on a continuous scale, right? So we had to break them down into, to measure the mutual information, we had to break it down, the continuous scale into discrete scale. There were probably many different discretization techniques in literature, but I used the most simplest I could think of. I just broke it down into 3. I labeled them as low, medium, high based on where they fall on a percentile scale. So if it's less than 33.3 percentile, I label it as low, like low objective function value. If it's between 33 and 66, I call it a medium value, and above 36, I call it a high value. So, but again, as I said, I'm not discussing the other important discretization techniques in literature. This is the simplest I use just for the sake of demonstration. So once I discretize each of those objective function values from a continuous scale to a discrete scale, I build a conditional probability table. So it just tells about a conditional probability table is how many occurrences of low, low, or low, high, or high, low. So those kind of combinations occur. So this is an example. So again, let me just repeat what I said. We calculate the objective function values, discretize them, build a conditional probability table, and then we find out the pair with the highest mutual information. When I say the pair with the highest mutual information, the pair with the least entropy, the least uncertainty. So in this case, if you look at this, So if you look at this column is phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And when you look at these 3, these are just mobilization, S is for stabilization, and T is for optimal strength utilization. So when I show a solid line, it means these pair of variables have the highest mutual information. And when I show a broken line, that means those pairs have the next best mutual information value in a decreasing order. So I'm more focused only on those solid lines, the pair with the solid lines. And this is data from one of the subjects. So if you look at this one, if you see the solid line between T, M, and almost in all the conditions here, so this is what exactly we found out. So under different conditions for all the subjects put together, we found out that in the 3rd phase, the mobilization and the optimal strength utilization were the most important strategies. So those were the least uncertain strategies. So given that I have a plethora of objective functions here, what is that I would be more concerned about in each phase of my activity? So predominantly in the 3rd phase, we found that more than 60% of the subjects, they observed mobilization and optimal strength utilization as the dominant objectives. We didn't really find any patterns in the first 2 phases, probably because of lack of more data. Maybe if I had more subjects and more trials, I could have found something there. So how does this work really help me? So now I already spoke to you about the different constraints, the environmental constraints, the task constraints, and the system constraints. So we controlled our experiments. So under those constraints, what are my objective functions? So if I manipulate my constraints, any of those constraints, the system, task, or environmental, probably my strategies might also change, right? So maybe that will give me an insight into how I could perform my activity in a better way. So I can use this as a diagnostic tool. If I have some expectation of what objective functions should I observe in each phase of my activity, and I see someone not observing those objective functions or not having those pair of objective functions with the highest mutual information value, we probably will manipulate any of their system, task, or environmental constraints to bring them back into those objective functions into those to follow those strategies. So again, as I said, this can be used to identify. Now, if under a perfect condition with no risk of injury or trauma, if I know these are my objective functions, and if I see someone deviating from those objective functions, I know obviously they might lead to some injury in the future. So I can use this as an injury detection mechanism. And we can also use this not just in manual material handling, we can also use this in movement and gait analysis while designing processes and all that stuff. So we can design the processes in such a way that it manipulates their constraints, and in turn, it manipulates the strategies they adopt in performing the activity. This is just a conclusion slide. So what exactly are we trying to do is to characterize the kinematic patterns in performing an activity using the interrelationships between the different strategies. So why just 3 strategies? I mean, it can be more than 3 objective functions. I mean, life is all about multi-objective optimization, right? You can have 5, 10, 15, 20, it doesn't matter. But we are only focused on what are the most important strategies, or what are the least uncertain, I should say the least uncertain and or the highest certain objectives in different phases of your activity. As I said, this tool will provide us with a diagnostic support. So if I know someone's not doing well, I know where I can focus on or which phase of their activity. So instead of having to redesign their whole activity, maybe I can just redesign some phases of their activity. Well, maybe I'll talk about some limitations of my work. As I pointed out already, I worked on a 2-dimensional model. The next step is to expand it to a 3-dimensional model. I just assumed that it's symmetric on either side of the body. Probably, most likely it might not be so it might not be the case. So I might have to expand it to a 3-dimensional case, and this is just tossing. And I could definitely expand it to different activities like lifting, pushing, pulling, or maybe lifting in a frontal plane, or lifting or tossing in with obstacles and all these cases. Right now we don't have any obstacles. It's just like a straightforward tossing here. So I think that's pretty much it. And I'm sorry I didn't have a question slide as such, but I think I'm done with my talk here.
For a couple questions.
Go ahead.
So it's really interesting what you've done using the neutral information criteria. Did you look into the fact that in the case of talking, you have now 5 steps?
That's the next. I'm sorry. That's a limitation to a part of my work. I didn't really identify what are the important strategies in my life. Although I had the data collected and worked on it, I didn't really present it here. So having said that, do I really know at this point what are the important objectives in each phase of a lifting activity? I don't really know. But I have the data collected and everything. So this experiment was intended to show the difference between lifting and tossing first, and then also demonstrate the variations in strategies in different phases of each activity, tossing and lifting. But unfortunately, I didn't have it here.
And in the future, you might see how the change in one of the steps.
Exactly, right. So we manipulate the activity and then try to see how the variations in the objective function relationships change. Oh, is that it?
I have a question about,
Sure.
I'm not familiar with injury data related to tossing versus lifting. How is that related, and how does this work fit into understanding the benefits or disadvantages between those 2 strategies?
Well, even you're right. I mean, we didn't gather any information about the injury data under each conditions, but what we presume we can do in the future is collect a large population, have some like a big data kind of thing, have a large database, and then also have some information about under what conditions a particular subject had injury, and then gather that information. Then we might have someone use that as a control group, and then have someone where we know they don't have any injuries under those conditions, see the variations in their objective functions, and probably identify or figure out whether that really works or not. But at this stage, this is just a speculation that this can be used as a injury detection tool. But I'm not really an injury, that kind of guy, so I might not have answered your question according to your interest. But That's the best I can do in terms of injury potential under different conditions and all that. Sure.
So based on the question, you might want to do from an optimization kind of objective function point of view is to have a state estimation where you're saying, for example, injury is characterized by tremor, force, so there might be some predictors you use, and use your modeling to link how you transition from one space to another.
Well, as a matter of fact, I propose this as I used optimization as a limitation because, as I said, human doesn't really calculate the different objective functions at different instances of the activity. Rather, he works in phases. So I tried to kind of, how should I put it? Trying to drive away the point from optimization that human doesn't really optimize different objective functions, but rather he works in phases. So he's only looking for a good enough solution. So that might be a way. Definitely, I might have to come up with some simulations to really prove this one. But again, it would be ironic that I have to go back to optimization to do that again, because my point is to drive away from optimization here. Right.
All right, let's thank our speaker.